Okay, so chapter 5, the engine of evolution. They open up the chapter. Okay, so chapter 5, the engine of evolution. So Coyne opens up the chapter by talking about the Asian giant hornet and how it's evolved over time for the specific purpose of killing. Its victim, being the European honeybee, hasn't been able to defend themselves from these Asian hornets the same way the Asian honeybees have. And that is because over time, these Asian honeybees that were a native species to Japan have been able to develop these evolutionary mechanisms to fend and attack. The same goes for the parasitic roundworms. These roundworms have developed in a way to reproduce themselves, so they would infect a host, in this case being an ant, and alter its appearance so that the stomach would be bright red, and it would actually move the belly up and mimic the appearance of a belly. In this way, the birds that can see the ant will eat it and eventually spread the parasitic roundworm eggs so that the cycle can repeat. These are all examples of adaptations that have been evolved over time so that the fitness of these organisms would be enhanced. And that is how they would be similar. So, mutations. What are mutations, and can mutations be beneficial or deleterious? So, mutations is pretty much a random sequence in the gene. So it could just be whether an allele is deleted or added into. There's plenty of ways a mutation can occur. So mutations can be either beneficial or deleterious, and the reason how you can know this is depending on the environment. For example, the environment can play a role in depending on what kind of phenotype the mutation. Oops. Okay, so for example, for the mice, if a mutation were to cause a mouse to be black, but it lives in an environment where the surroundings are lighter, so in this case a beach, then the chances of it being seen by a predator are much higher, making this mutation probably deleterious. Whereas vice versa, if you were to get uh, a white mice living in a dark environment, in this case a field with lots of mud, then this mutation can be beneficial and increase the fitness of these mice. So adaptations are essentially what we just went over. How they're good for the individual, it's good for the individual, but not good for the species as a whole. And adaptations do need to be evolved by increasing the reproductive output of its possessor.
So when we talk about evolution, natural selection always comes up because it is a very important part of natural selection, but it is not the only vital part. So as most biologists define, evolution is also the change in the promotion of the alleles in a population. As an example, every time sexual reproduction happens, both parents contribute alleles to the offspring. And this is a very random situation. So probability of passing on alleles go up as the number of offsprings increase. So when we talk about genetic drift, it is a random change in the frequency of genes over time. It is also a legitimate type of evolution which involves changes in the frequencies of alleles over time. But genetic drift does not arise from natural selection, and it also reduces genetic variation. Another important factor is that genetic drift affects smaller populations rather than larger populations. And there are two types, bottleneck and founder's effect. So these are few examples for genetic drift. Genetic drift is a random situation. There's no control over the cause or the results of a genetic drift. So it could be either an environmental factor like a mudslide or a flood that eliminates certain part of a population. So in this example, there is a group of beetles, green and brown, and a man steps on the green beetles accidentally killing most of them. So this act alone could result in fewer green beetles being produced in a population. Another example is that in a wildflower population which has blue, purple, and pink flowers. So there was a mudslide, and this mudslide kills most of the blue flowers. So when the time progresses, you can see that the blue flowers eventually die out, leaving only the purple and pink wildflowers. So both genetic drift and natural selection are very important to evolution because they both produce genetic change. But genetic drift is a very random process, and natural selection is not. And another change is that genetic drift can change the frequencies of alleles regardless of how useful they are to their carrier. Selection, on the other hand, always gets rid of harmful alleles and raises the frequencies of beneficial ones. So, genetic drift is a very important factor to evolution, but the only thing is that it does not cause adaptations. For adaptations, you need non-random natural selection. So what drift can do is cause the evolution of features that are neither useful nor harmful to the organism.
Criteria of evolution via natural selection. There are four main requirements needed to say that evolution is occurring via natural selection. They are 1. Variation, 2. Heritability, 3. Differential survival, and 4. Reproduction of variants. Natural evolution through microbial organisms. Instead of scientists selecting which organisms survive and reproduce, they can emulate the patterns of natural selection by experimenting on microbes like bacteria. This allows us to demonstrate authentic evolutionary change. But why choose bacteria? The reasons are as follows. They have very short and frequent generation times. They divide as often as every 20 minutes. 2. Their environment is easily controlled and can be manipulated for experimental purposes. And 3. They're highly adaptable. Such examples of their adaptability are temperature, starvation, and toxins. The first experiment conducted by Richard Lenski and his work with E. coli. He conducted an experiment testing the bacterium's ability to go from high levels of food to low levels. Glucose was placed in a dish with E. coli and only replenished the next day. He did this for 18 years, or 40,000 bacterial generations, and found that the culture had mutated and adapted to grow 70% faster than the original bacteria at the beginning of the experiment. Throughout the experiment, they found 9 genes in total that had mutated. Now, it's clear that microbes are amazingly efficient at mutating, evolving, and adapting. But what happens when they are too efficient? Antibiotics. Antibiotics were first developed in the 1940s and were able to effectively cure numerous bacterial infections. Unfortunately, many bacterial strains became resistant to different antibiotic treatments. To review, bacteria are unique in that they have short generation times and large population sizes. When bacteria is wiped out by medication, the few that survive do so because they developed a mutation that is resistant to medication. These mutated bacteria duplicate and become the new population, and the resistance eventually spreads worldwide. While human interaction with its environment has had a heavy hand in bacterial and viral evolution, it has also affected other living species, causing a few organisms who are exposed to the harsh changes to be fortunate enough to develop mutations that allow the population to go from being susceptible to resistant. Examples include insect resistance to DDT, plant adaptation to herbicides, and algae resistance to heavy metals polluting water sources. This allows us to infer that when a population encounters a stress that doesn't come from humans, such as change in salinity, temperature, or rainfall, natural selection will often produce an adaptive response. But what about natural interference? Many people would still not be convinced of natural selection without seeing it occur to higher species in a genuine manner. Selection in the wild. The issues with observing natural selection in nature. There are a few problems with wanting to see evolution occur in real time outside of a lab setting. One, it is extremely slow. The evolution of feathers took thousands of years to develop, for example. Also, it will be extremely difficult and rare for us to see macroevolution in our lifetime, only microevolution. Third, most organisms are experiencing stabilizing selection. In order for us to see real-time natural selection, it must be dramatic and cause relatively quick changes, quickly enough to be witnessed within a human lifetime. Species with short generation times will once again be critical for this to be possible. So what's the difference between macroevolution and microevolution? Well, microevolution is when small changes occur to one or a few features of a species, and macroevolution is the transition of one type of plant or animal into another. In other words, speciation. An example of microevolution would be the varying dog breeds that exist on Earth, and macroevolution would be the differences between different species such as humans and lizards. Defining stabilizing selection. All species on Earth are already very well adapted to their environments. This means that there is a little reason for natural selection to cause major changes within a population. It is a rarity for a population to encounter major environmental challenges that would induce more noticeable changes. This is where stabilizing selection comes in. Even though there are no environmental stressors to cause noticeable change, stabilizing selection changes allele frequencies in the gene pool by weeding out traits that are not optimal. This could also be considered part of gene flow. An example would include cull birds, smaller or larger than ideal, beginning to disappear from the population because they are not as fit. To reiterate, the best place to find selection in action in nature is in species that have short generation times and species adapting to a new environment. When species invade a new habitat and species experience severe environmental change. And examples would include the medium ground finch of the Galapagos Islands and the soapberry bug, also known as Jadera haematoloma. So the story of the Galapagos finch. Drought caused the finch's food supply, seeds, to come into shortage. Only large seeds became available, which required big beaks to utilize. Small beaked finches died off, while the bigger beaked individuals survived to reproduce. Later generations in finches showed a 10% increase in beak size, all thanks to environmental stressors. So what can be taken away? These examples demonstrate that we can directly witness natural selection, leading to better adaptation.
Can selection build complexity? As Darwin mentioned, how can we be sure that selection was involved, since all complex features take a long time to evolve and many did so when we were even around to see how it happened? We all know that natural selection does work in nature, such as it can change the beaks of birds. A perfect example was Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, where he hypothesized that different beak shapes were related to food gathering. But the big question is, can it build complexity? Because some biological systems are too complicated, it is not possible to have evolved from basics. Complex traits include structures or systems with multiple interacting parts. Some examples of complexity are the flagella, the blood clotting, and eyes. Complex traits such as the bacterial flagella consist of all proteins to be present in order for the flagellum to serve primary function, motility, impossible to have been derived from incomplete precursor. It must have been created in complete state with full function by God. Opponents of evolution say that some traits are irreducibly complex, and could not have evolved through small changes. However, biologists have shown that this is not true. Evolution can produce very complex traits because natural selection allows small beneficial changes to accumulate over time, such as the eyes. Darwin's evolution of the camera eye. He proposed a stepwise evolution of the human eye by showing examples of differences in the eyes of other creatures that seem to be less complex. From simple eyes, Darwin proceeded to demonstrate very simple beginnings that show an adaptive value to each step until the final product was built. Some examples, such as the planarian, have simple eye spots. A fish eye is more complex, but not to the extent of the human eye. Darwin's comparison of the simple and complex eyes told him how vision worked. The increasing of complexity of the eye led Darwin to believe that the eye was due to natural selection. In 1994, Nielsen and Pellier created a model of the eye to find out how difficult evolution really is. They allowed the shape of the model eye to change at random. This fits with the idea that adaptive evolution proceeds in small, gradual stages, but there was only an estimate of the time required for an eye to evolve. The complex eye demonstrated that it is well within natural selection reach to evolve. Finally, models have shown that natural selection can produce complex features, and that natural selection is the cause of adaptive evolution. However, evolution has demonstrated that it is a step by step process, but not every feature of evolution.